following the direction in the cryptic message you received. It doesn't take long before they lead you from familiar roads onto a disused trail overgrown by weeds and the roots of spindly trees. A light drizzle begins to fall as you travel. As you continue on, gradually the haze and brush give way, revealing a bald hilltop. There stands a grim black tower, the last defiant turret of a long crumbled fortress. Attached to this tower is a 3-story manor house, weather-beaten and veined with ivy. A porch girds the house, its sagging roof sheltering a stout front door that stands open and emits a flickering light. Anybody else getting some serious horror movie vibes here? Aw man, we're in Ravenloft, aren't we? Whoa, what's Ravenloft? It's time for some Eldritch history. It is October, which means it's a time of ghosts and goblins, pumpkin spice is in the air, and if you play D&D, it's time for Ravenloft. The horror setting that covers all the genres you can imagine and more. If you want general concepts of how Ravenloft came to be as a setting, you can check out my D&D campaign settings episodes. They'll have some of the more general aspects of the setting itself, how the domains of dread are various pockets built as prisons and torture chambers for the most vile creatures in the D&D multiverse who become its dark lords. All this overseen by the dark powers of Ravenloft, these mysterious entities that seem to want to punish the bad and reward the good, but they're kind of ephemeral and ineffable in their plans. This episode, I'm going through Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, taking a look at the various domains in there, seeing what they're about, mostly detailing how they've changed over the years, or grabbing some stuff from the older editions, mostly second, a little bit of third. Bring forward to your games if you want a little bit more to add to some of these descriptions, and pointing out any Easter eggs or trivia that I noticed along the way. There's a lot to get through this episode, so I don't want to waste too much time up front, but I do want to call out Ravenloft is dark. There's all kinds of terrible things that happen here. So content warning for basically anything. You have murder, death, suicide, abuse, mind control, assault, basically anything. All those are on the table in this episode. I don't want to put anybody through anything that they want to go through. So if any of those seem like, hey, no, I don't want to deal with that. So just skip this episode. I'm not going to go into big detail about anything. I'm not trying to get gruesome with it or anything, but they come up. It's the backstories to these characters. So that's not for you. No worries. This will be at least a 2-parter. So see you in a couple episodes, maybe when we get into the lighter topics. But if you're all good with that, then let's jump right in. Go to Ravenloft. All right. So if you're following along with Van Richten's Guide at home, first up should be Barovia. But I'm not going to talk about that one in this episode. Namely because Barovia and Count Strahd von Zarovich are so iconic and so fundamental to Ravenloft that they deserve their own episode. Spoilers, that's going to be the next one. So talk about that in a couple weeks. So if we're skipping Barovia, first one we're actually going to talk about is Blutspur. Which, fun fact, if you take out the E, it's the German word Blutspur, which translates roughly to trail of blood, which is cool, but also doesn't really make sense for this domain, so I don't know why they went with that one, but I guess whatever. The idea behind this one is the Dark Lord is the god brain of Blutspur, and this is a Mind Flayer elder brain that went too far. It became so dark and corrupted that it became diseased, and the other elder brains actually tried to kill it in order to make sure they didn't get diseased from it. But then the dark powers of Ravenloft rescued it, basically, and dropped it into Blutspur. So this domain is all about the cosmic horror, so Cthulhu mythos type of stuff, elder evils, unknowable, ineffable plans. The whole surface area is racked by these electrical storms, and it's desolate, and nobody lives there. But the Mind Flayers all live underground in these vast labyrinthian catacombs that serve as their laboratories, a prison, breeding grounds, all kinds of weird things are going down under there. And building off of that, for 5th edition, they made it into more of a alien abduction type of storyline going on with it, which I think is really cool. Before, they didn't really have that. The biggest thing going for it was the adventure Thoughts of Darkness, in which they created these illithid mind flayer vampires. That was part of a plan between the High Master, which is this rogue mind flayer that's cut off from the rest of them, who's kind of trying to work against the God Brain, as well as Lissa von Zarevich, who is Strahd's great niece, which, again, we'll cover that more in the Strahd episode, but she's pretty interesting. But those two banded together to create these vampiric mind flayers, which are still there in 5th edition, which is cool. That's if you thought mind flayers were bad, well, now they're vampires too. Then they also now have this alien abduction subplot, like I mentioned, which actually kind of gives the place somewhere to go. Because before, it's like, you can't live on the surface. The tunnels and stuff are so impossible to traverse that you can't really map it or anything like that. Not well. My thoughts on that is you could model it after like a map of the synapses of the brain. Just have it like all these crazy connections and big hubs and stuff. I thought that'd be a cool way to map the unmappable. But yeah, I think it's really smart to add in this alien abduction stories because a lot of it kind of correlates pretty well. There's always been a layer of memory issues with it. Those electrical storms on the surface have affected memory. And then these alien aberrations, these creatures that are just so foreign to us, have always done these experiments in this place. So hey, you get taken here, you get experimented on, you can't remember about it, and you get sent back home. It's totally an alien abduction story, right? Instead of just playing here, I think having your PCs or some NPCs that they're familiar with start experiencing these weird dreams or a mark, or they mention even like little implanted things you could find. Like, why is there a little metal thing implanted in my arm? You know, have these after effects of it that they can't remember what happened, and then they could uncover the memories or try to go back to figure out what happened to them. I think those are the cool kind of stories you could tell with Bloodspur. So next up is Borka, and this is ruled by Ivana Boritsi and Ivan Delisnia, and it's inspired by the Borgia-ruled Italy, basically. So you got these ruling noble families that just mess around with each other. They're playing these deadly games of court intrigue, and they use the common people as they see fit. And Ivana is a master chemist and poisoner who creates toxins with spell-like effects, and she prepares for every possibility, like Batman. She's got contingencies on contingencies. Ivan, meanwhile, is this man-child who surrounds himself with playthings and breaks them at his leisure. They were born on the same night, which has led to them being called the Dark Twins, but they're opposites in many ways. Ivana is cold and calculating, with a perpetual youth that undermines her cunning and capability, while Ivan is rash and emotional, yet appears as a decrepit old man despite his childlike demeanor. And we get the first of the oft-repeated idea of these lavish estates of nobles holding multiple annual balls per family. So it's always a ball going on in Borka, which I think gets a little bit overplayed in Ravenloft, to be fair. It's like, okay, I get this trope, but it seems like every other domain has this kind of part of it. Meanwhile, the common people are living in these impoverished cities and whatnot. Yeah, it would not be fun to be a commoner in Ravenloft. You're basically never having a good time. So changes to this domain, I really like. I think they did a lot more with it than they had before. An interesting thing to note is that there were changes over the course of the Ravenloft cycle. One of the big ones happened with the Grand Conjunction, which we'll get into, but suffice to say, it really altered how everything looked on the Ravenloft map. But they've kind of just folded those into, at least some of those changes, into 5e's version of Ravenloft. They've kind of altered the timeline, which we saw in Curse of Strahd, but they've kept some of the stuff. For example, Borka used to be controlled by Camille Delisnia, who's Ivana's mother, and she was this Black Widow type. She killed Ivana's father, Klaus Baritzi, by, it's pretty messed up. She subjected him to a poison that merged his flesh with that of the chambermaid, who he was having an affair with. So that's gruesome. And still, Ivana killed her, and then that's when she took over. Ivan, on the other hand, used to be more of a poisoner himself, just everybody was poisoning everybody. And he had his own domain of Dorvinia. And the two actually got along when they were separated by these domains. there's a lot more interplay between the Dark Lords before. But then during this grand conjunction, when everything gets shaken up, the two domains are merged together into just Borka, which is like what we got in 5th edition. So overall, I like the changes with Borka because Ivan actually gets like his own characteristics. Before he's just kind of basically just another Ivana is like, I don't know if this is necessary. So having them two distinct is pretty cool, and the evil toys and stuff is its own kind of thing to play around with. So it makes sense. And having them as like these dark reflections of each other is cool too. A couple things I noticed looking at the entry is that there's some callbacks to earlier things. They mentioned Nastalia Romaine, who's this like assassin who deals in poison. But actually in the older editions, Nastalia was one of the people who almost always is at the side of Ivana, as well as the Hafistani Jongleur, who's this French itinerant minstrel / dancer, which is what his name comes from and basically how he acts. But Nastalia is a creature known as a Ermor de Nung, and these are individuals changed by Ivana, and they have literal poison running through their veins, and their mere touch means death. And Ivana actually used Nastalia to kill her mother. And because of that, Nastalia is still haunted by the ghosts of Camille. So she uses a dagger of venom instead of her more Donung powers. And this isn't from the 5th edition thing. I just noticed this in my looking up of Borka. But there's this plant called the adder's tongue that grows throughout Ravenloft. And it's very useful against poison, although it could potentially lead to madness depending on how you use it. But it's actually illegal in Borka for reasons of Ivana, probably. Like, what do you mean helpful against poison? No, get that out of here. There's also a couple cool things I noticed on the map. One, it shows the House of Lament, which is detailed in the adventure in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. It used to be its own pocket domain, which would pop around to other domains of dread. So whichever one you were in, you could encounter the House of Lament. But eventually, during all the changes, it came to rest in Borka. So canonically, it is always in Borka now. So it was cool to see it on the map. I was like, oh, hey, look at that. And then another thing on the map is it has an entry for Sholamans, which is an actual, well, I don't know if it was actually real or just we have stories about it in the real world. It's a Romania school of black magic. It's actually referenced in Dracula. It's cited as where the Dracula family and Van Helsing had studied. And legends say that the devil himself taught there. It's cool to see it there. I was like, oh, hey, look at that. Okay, but enough on Borka. We got a lot to get through. So next up is the Carnival, whose Dark Lord is Nepenthe, this sentient sword, which is interesting and new for 5th edition. I didn't see anything about Nepenthe before, but it does remind me of Ebonbane, the Dark Lord of a small domain or an island domain known as Shadowborn Manor, which was, again, a sentient sword that kind of ruled over the place. So, seems they kind of updated that. Shadowborn Manor was another one, kind of like the House of Lament or Death House, haunted house type of thing. So, I like keeping the idea of it, but giving it a unique, or at least adding it to a different domain that has a more unique style. And the Carnival is fun because it can go around to all the different domains. You'll never know where it's going to show up. And it's also the mirror of the Witchlight Carnival from Wild Beyond the Witchlight. The carnivals both travel across the plains and show up randomly, and they met up and they decided, hey, let's swap. So the two gentlemen, Mr. Witch and Mr. Light, who ran the carnival of Ravenloft before, switched with Isolde, who runs the Ravenloft Carnival now. And her whole deal is that she wields Nepenthe, and she's seeking out the Caller, who used to be called the Gentleman Caller. This ephemeral being who goes around the domains of Ravenloft and mostly seduces people and then has a bunch of offspring and has these weird machinations that nobody really knows what they're doing. It's said that the jongleur, Ivana Boritzi's companion, is potentially one of their children as well. So they might have some plans for Borka. I do like the gender neutrality of the Caller now, especially because it relates to succubi and incubi, which now are one and the same. It's just whatever form they choose to take. So it makes sense that the collar would be able to do so as well, being the ultimate tempter, the ultimate mimic of being able to take whatever form. Why wouldn't they be able to switch their appearance in such a way? I think there's a lot of good calls with the changes they made with the carnival, because back in the day, Isolde's whole thing was that she was the source of this thing called the twisting, which would change people's outward appearance to more accurately match their inward. So if you were evil, you might take more of a devil-like appearance, which is problematic, of course. Like, at least the people in this Ravenloft domain, you only looked monstrous if you were monstrous, but that's really problematic for people who actually have physical differences from the quote-unquote norm. Like, oh, the people here are evil if they get changed like that. So that's just a bad connection to make. And the carnival in 5th edition is kind of gets a little bit bland, I think, because they lose out on the quote-unquote freaks type of idea with the carnival. Like, that's what gave it its horror, these people who are different, which it shouldn't. It definitely should not. But they didn't quite replace it with anything. Good job getting rid of it. But I think they needed to add something different to it to make it more interesting as a domain. They added the evil fairy thing, like chasing down Isolde, but I don't know, that doesn't really do much for me. Like, oh, it's not the carnival people who are evil, it's the people following them, even though nobody really knows that. So I don't know. They needed something. I don't know if they hit it, but I'm glad they got rid of, hey, you look different, you're evil. Like, no, that's not how it works. Well, plenty of the performers described in the old books are problematic, to say the least, that I don't want to get into. There were some ones that I found that I think are pretty cool. There's this whole subcategory of Vistani that wound up at the carnival, and they were called the Skura. And while they had a thing where they had taken a vow of silence so that they wouldn't be affected by the carnival, I think you could either remove that or play with it for a different reason of why they can't or choose not to talk. Some of these included the Fates 3, known as Leer, Pry, and Scream. And they were dancers who would imitate the spectators watching their show and then reveal their dark secrets through their dances, which I think is a cool, showing them like going out and killing somebody or something like that could be cool. Like, oh, hey, what are they doing here? The leader of these Skura was known as Madame Fortuna, who was able to talk because she removed the protective mask, which, best part, I forgot. They are protected from this because they wear these masks, these animal masks, but that's what causes them to be unable to talk. And so Madame Fortuna took off the mask so she could talk on behalf of all the other Skura. And then her eyes turned black and she became blind to non-living matter, but any living creatures she can see the auras of. So it's kind of a cool idea. There were also the Blade Brothers, who were Skura, metalworkers, jugglers, and knife throwers. Always need some knife throwers in a carnival. And then there's also the Crimson Rose, who she would charm people through her dance, but she goes into a murderous rage if people are a bit pushy with their advances, which I don't know about murder, but rage, yeah, sure enough, yeah, fair, fair. But she has a son known as the Familiar, and he can perform this inexplicable vanishing act, and he's the son of the Crimson Rose and the Collar. So there could be a cool interaction between him and Isolde if she found this fact out. And then a couple of non-Skura performers who I find interesting. There's Mr. Question Mark. It's the symbol of a question mark, who's a wax golem. And they can take the appearance of others, but Mr. Question Mark in particular actually believes he's the people he imitates. And when he's not imitating anybody else, he's kind of this dull and lifeless creature. Not literally, just like he's very monotone and, he only gets personality traits when he's imitating others. And then there's also Raja Singh, who's this were-leopard who is part of an attack on the carnival who were defeated. And he's now trapped in were form, except on the nights of the full moon. And they just keep him in one of those, carnival animal cages, which, little punishment for his crime of attacking. So finally, there's the Illuminated Man, who's the classic tattooed person at the carnival. But he's covered in moving tattoos, which are called night terrors. And they're related to the deepest fears of him and people watching the show. So they move around and they can show you stuff that you're afraid of, which is pretty cool. Like, his existence kind of locks in the fact that this Ravenloft carnival is definitely inspired by Something Wicked This Way Comes, in my mind. Like, oh, definitely get that old Ray Bradbury feeling from all of this. And there's also some fun little Easter eggs, I guess you would call them, for the descriptions of people who are in it. Like Amelia the Vampiress, who's that bat-like winged acrobat, is from the old books. Charlotte the Fire Eater, it mentions that she says that her blood produces flames, but that's actually what it used to do back in the day. And then Celissa the Snake says she was originally a snake, and that's totally true. She was just a snake that was transformed. And then the stuff with Tyndall, how he doesn't cast his reflection and stuff, is actually because he's a mirror reflection of Tyndaphilus, who's a mage trapped in a mirror, like in one of the random tables that mentions that. It's like, oh, hey, it's all legit. Tyndall is this shadow version of him, kind of like the us people of this dark reflections trying to take the place of their originators. It's kind of cool. So yeah, those are the ones I really like from the older editions. They don't have some of the problems of other people described in there. But again, definitely, if you want to use this domain, which I think is a cool one, I think you can kind of do it like Witchlight, where it just shows up randomly. It could be a very good way to get into Ravenloft or travel around it. But as a domain of dread itself, you need that evil aspect, I feel like. That's the whole point. And I guess Isolde can take on that mantle of her being so bent on revenge and punishment that she could do some problematic stuff. But the performers, the people who are different in this carnival, I feel like should be, they're just people. Their look or act a little bit different, but that doesn't make them deserving of Ravenloft or evil. So there's something to watch out for. You don't want to do that. All right, but moving on to a place certainly created by quite an evil character. We have Darkon, whose current Dark Lord is nobody. But originally, well, quote-unquote originally, it was Aslan Rex. And Aslan is actually originally from Orth, the world of Greyhawk, one of the original D&D campaign settings. And Aslan, originally known as Firan Zalhanan, studied magic to his own detriment. He intentionally summoned a demon, which wound up killing his brother, which was an accident. And he was sent into exile with his teacher, but returned to take the throne when his father died. Then from then on, he enacted draconian laws, which caused him to kill his own son in punishment. And he constantly sought more magic to extend his life and or bring his son back to life, depending on the day of the week or who's writing about him at that point. And eventually he's ambushed by rebels who are trying to get rid of his rule, and he's whisked away into the mists before he's killed. And then from the get-go, he is all about getting out of Ravenloft. He wound up in Barovia first, and he taught Strahd some magic. And they conspired to escape. More on how that played out in the Strahd episode coming up. But he failed with that, and he went into the mists, and Darkon was born. This is a recurring theme in the old lore where people wind up either in Barovia or a different domain, and then they'd run into the mists. And normally this would be fatal or you'd just be lost forever. But if you're sufficiently evil, they'd kind of open up for you and make you your own domain, which happens with Aslan. It's said that he got the name Aslan because he was saying his title, this wizard king Aslan, and people misheard it, and so he became Aslan from that. So another one of his escape plots resulted in the Grand Conjunction, also known as the Great Upheaval, where domains were displaced, some absorbed into others. This is Dorvinia went into Borca during this time. Some vanished altogether, and others were created. But his plan ultimately failed because he was going off this prophecy with all these couplets, but he enacted some out of order. So he kind of went haywire on him. So it had a big effect on Ravenloft, but Aslan wasn't able to escape. Another plot involved him cloning himself a bunch of times and then trying to absorb all the magical powers of these clones. And then the most recent one, he created the Doomsday Device, which was supposed to turn him into a demi-lich and allow his essence to escape. Enacting this turned one of his clones, named Llewellyn Dacian, into a negative energy elemental, which is a cool concept. And his name in that form was Death, which, pretty metal there. Aslan tried using the Doomsday Device again, and it caused this event known as the Requiem, where Aslan sacrificed at least 25,000 people, and it resulted in this wave of necrotic energy sweeping the plane. Aslan was dematerialized and basically fused with the land itself, and Darkon was divided into sections with demi-Dark Lords ruling over them. So kind of like what we got in 5th edition, although they had different choices in the past, including Death, that negative energy elemental based off one of his clones. And he took control of Il-Aluk, basically the capital city. This is where Aslan sacrificed all those people, and they were raised up as undead after that. And then because Death was so effective or so evil as a governing power there, the Dark Powers turned Il-Aluk into its own domain called the Necropolis, with him as a full Dark Lord and, just all undead people because of the actions of Aslan. But Aslan would go on to return in the animated corpse of his son, which he had kept in his castle this whole time. Although, because he's in his son's body, his son's spirit now haunts him constantly, although Aslan doesn't really pay attention to him. Some other things that Aslan has gotten up to: he commissioned this person known only as S to create the Ravenloft Gazetteers in-world. Like, this is the story behind this old line of products that kind of did what Van Richten's guide did, just in smaller chunks. And there's a bunch of things around this whole thing. It said that S might actually be one of Aslan's clones. It says that the purpose of this might be him looking into the Caller's children, trying to identify them so he can use them to his own nefarious purposes. And you'll notice I'm talking a lot about Aslan because, honestly, I think the Darkon kind of suffers from its Dark Lord being far more interesting than it is. It's just another kind of medieval area ruled over by this powerful leader who's not interested in it, really. He just wants to escape. So he has all these machinations, but doesn't really affect his land. It's not like Strahd, where I am the ancient, I am the land, He doesn't care. He wants out. That's all he wants. So he's got all these things going on. He's got all his fingers and other pies and stuff like that. I think Darkon is kind of boring. Aslan is great, but I think what they did with the previous, having it separated with all these other Dark Lords, is a good idea. So I'm glad that they kept that idea for 5th edition, because I think that's a much stronger story going on in this plane. But I feel like having these different groups of people trying to divvy up the land at least gives you some interesting back and forth you can do, as possibilities for what's happening. And then a few of the ones from 5th edition, the people who are trying to take over in Aslan's absence, are versions of people from previous editions. So we got Alcio Baron Metis, sister of Baron Metis, who turned Rudolf Van Richten's son Erasmus into a vampire. Then Van Richten Mercy killed Erasmus, but then Baron struck back because, hey, that was my spawn. So he killed Van Richten's wife, Ingrid, which eventually Van Richten killed Baron. That was the original story. Now it just says that Baron killed the wife and son before Van Richten could stop him, which I feel like is a little bit weaker of a story. I like the back and forth of these people actually becoming like truly adversaries or rivals. It's also in the old lore that Baron himself was brought back to life by the Caller, I believe. But I kind of like this idea of his sister taking his spot and just taking the title of Baron. That's cool. I like that. Van Richten could hear that Baron Metis is back and be like, what? And then go, like, you're not Baron. I think that's a better story than, no, he's brought back to life, because of course he is. And then the whole thing with Darkulus Rex is based off of previous lore as well. So there's this interesting thing with the Domains of Dread in which they have these timelines that are kind of messed up. Because they come into existence when something happens in the quote-unquote real world, the prime material plane of D&D. And then a section of land is either copied or actually drawn into the Domain of Dread, usually when something very terrible happens, or when somebody really evil is about to die. Like, they deserve worse than death, let's trap them here. But instead of just having it be like, oh, that's the point where everything starts and then we make a whole new history, because they kind of like make the Dark Powers make this land, they inhabit it with people who is kind of still like, where did these people come from? You got that whole thing from Curse of Strahd where it's like, oh, they don't really have souls. They're just basically constructed, not really people, until some souls start coming in. But so instead of just having everything start from right now, You have these existing people, you have it be this like eternal loop, but it also has a history. So when Aslan came into Darkon, even though it was made for him, there was a previous lord known as Darkulus Rex, who Aslan dethroned. But it's also probably just an aspect of Aslan himself, the Wizard King aspect of him, that also fought the amnesiac Ferran Zal-Honan, who is his personal aspect before he became Aslan. So it kind of had this dual nature thing happening before, and then Aslan came in, whose bull took the throne from there. So you got this kind of interesting, like, at some point, Aslan came here and created this demiplane, or it was made for him, but you still have this backstory that is kind of just manufactured, these fake memories that come in. And it happens in a lot of different domains where it's kind of interesting trying to piece together when actually did this happen, or how much is just a constructive backstory to make it like a rational world. Because especially it trying to be a eternal prison for these Dark Lords, you kind of need some ties. If they just showed up and it's like nothing has any history, nobody knows anything, it'd be weird. The idea is to keep them here, even though it doesn't really work in Aslan's case. It's like he's always wanted to get out, so he knows what's up. Whereas some of the Dark Lords not all of them seem to be aware that they're trapped in these domains of dread, and they kind of go through the motions as if they don't know. All right, but enough about Aslan and Darkon. Let's go on to the next one, which is Dementliu, whose Dark Lord is Sidra Donaire, and this whole thing is based off of Renaissance France. Also, another thing with Ravenloft is that it doesn't stick with like medieval times. It definitely goes to a lot of different time places than standard D&D will. Now, in Dementliu, you once again have this whole concept of grand balls and parties thrown by the nobles and the rich. But in this case, it's all this facade where they're just putting on appearances. So the most destitute are trying to be middle class. The middle class people are trying to appear as nobles. Whereas the only noble really is this Dark Lord Sidra. And punishment for not keeping up that appearance is death, basically. She comes for you. I feel like if you have the right group, this could be a cool place to be, like having this more theatrical group, or putting on airs, or to teach your character a lesson if they're always pretending to be of a higher station than they're supposed to be. And Sidra does this by taking on this aspect of the Red Death, which I think this is a cool way of tying in a previous sub-campaign setting, the Mask of the Red Death, which of course is all based off the Edgar Allan Poe short story of this party where at the very end the Red Death comes and starts killing people. But in the history of Ravenloft, there was a whole different product line of the Red Death, which took place on this Gothic Earth, which was like 1800s, our actual Earth, but with fake people added into real people. And the Red Death in that was this mysterious entity, kind of took the place of the Dark Powers, and it represents pure evil, and it's served by figures such as Frankenstein's monster or Professor Moriarty, who of course are fake, but then also fictionalized versions of real people, such as Delphine Lalaurie, Imhotep, who's often becomes the mummy in fiction, and Vlad Tepes, of course, inspiration for Dracula. So I like them adding that into this different version of it in which Sidra becomes this red specter of death who punishes people for not following the mores of her domain. But interestingly enough, she's new to 5th edition because previously Dementliu was ruled over by Dominique Donaire, who kind of had some different stuff going on. He was a lot like the Purple Man from Marvel Comics, Kilgrave from Jessica Jones, if you watch that show. Dominique, much like the Purple Man, has the ability to dominate other people's will. So he would be able to turn people to do what he wants in such a fashion. And these people would become known as obedience. One of them was the Lord Governor Marcel Guignol. His name is based off the Grand Guignol, the theater in France. Grand Guignol translates to Great Puppet because it's named for a specific French puppet character, Guignol. His stories were aimed at children. The character has a sharp wit and way with words that can appeal to adults. But suffice to say, this theater put on these very horrific shows. They were very into bloody, risque, horrific theater. You can kind of see a depiction of it in the TV show Penny Dreadful. They have an episode, or several, that's set there. They show a very, very graphic show. So be warned about that. But if you want to check it out, it's interesting. But interesting that the Lord Governor is named Gignol when, it literally means puppet, and he is an obedient of the Dark Lord. So makes sense. A bit on the nose if you know all that, but it's fun. And then one more aspect from older editions of Dementlio that I just like is that there's this person known as the Living Brain, which is the preserved specimen of Rudolf van Albrecher. And it's literally a brain in the jar. And they use their awakened psionic abilities from this transformation in order to dominate and control a crime ring that opposes Dominique Donner. So if you want a rival faction going up against Sidra, you could have this living brain, which would be interesting. And we get back-to-back gender-bent Dark Lords with Falkovnia up next with Vladeska Drakov. So this whole domain is inspired by 20th century fascism as well as Vlad the Impaler, having this totalitarian leader who likes to impale people on spikes, but also having to deal with, now we have this whole zombie subplot going on in 5th edition where every month zombies storm the cities and Vladeska has to make tough calls in order to ensure the survival of as many of her people as she can. But in earlier editions of Ravenloft, Vlad Drakov was the Dark Lord, and he was originally from Taladas on Kryn, so Dragonland setting, where he's a cruel mercenary leader, and he would always try to take over Darkon. Despite every time he did so, a wave of undead would crash into his forces and destroy them. He always thought it was Aslan sending him, but it probably was just the Dark Lords being like, no, you're staying where you are. You're trying to be the conqueror, but you're not allowed to anymore. That was his punishment. Vlad also had this prolonged life, so he looked like he was 60 years old, but he had ruled Volkovnia for 90 years plus, and he also had a bunch of children in that time. And he was very, very much like on the nose for Vlad the Impaler. I mean, his name is Vlad. And during the revisions for 5th edition, the designers were like, well, we already have Strahd, who is Dracula, who is Vlad the Impaler. So they wanted to change it up, which is why we get Vladeska, who kind of dials some of that back. But we still get this conquering force who's in these insurmountable odds, have the conqueror, but you're not able to conquer anything. You're in this losing battle. Got to be the worst torture there is for them. Which is the whole point, because they're being tortured, because they're bad people. Some little tidbits, little trivia from Falkovnia's entry in Ben Rickening's guide. You got that whole little side part about the fallen star near Delmunster, which is a body taker plant, which is totally just invasion of the body snatchers call out, which I think is great. And then in one of the tables, it also calls out the knight named Gondagal, who says that she can help people get to somewhere safe, which she's also a gender-bent version of a previous character, who he was a minor noble turned mercenary turned conqueror from Cormyr in the Forgotten Realms. And he attempted to conquer Falkovnia as a liberator after seeing Drakov's cruel nature. But his attempts failed, and he fled to Darkon to seek the aid of Aslan Rex, who, as I mentioned, Vlad was always trying to attack and annex his land. But Gondagal was attacked by vampires and awoke to find himself being nursed back to health by Helena Vladanova, who's a member of the Circle, or a Knight of the Shadows, and a champion of the downtrodden. So Gondagal saw the error of his ways, which is interesting because he very much mirrored the history of Vlad. He had tried to take over lands. It didn't go well for him, and then he found himself in Ravenloft. But seeing Vlad's temperament and how, you cross me, you're going up on a pike. You're being impaled, Okay, he turned over this new leaf, so it's kind of this mirror of Vlad. There's a lot of that in Ravenloft, having this dark reflection or light reflection of like, hey, this is, the other side of the coin. So Gondagal, the male Gondagal from the previous versions, he eventually became the leader of the Circle, which is all about trying to help people out. And it would become known as the Shadow Insurrection under him, trying to turn the lands of Ravenloft around for the better, which I don't know if that's possible. But with him, the Shadow Insurrection would wear cloaks of black and gold that only allows people who need their help to see them, which is really cool. Like, that's a cool magic item. Like, oh, you can see me? Okay, well, how can I help you? And Gondagal and Helena would become lovers, which I think would be interesting if you have them be the parents of this new female Gondagal. It'd be interesting. Oh, my parents have been fighting against the Drakovs for years. And Gondagal would become known as the Lost King, and he would ally with the spawn of the lizard, which was a kobold-resistant movement in Falkovnia, and it's run by this kobold known as the Basilisk, who is unusually tall and excessively clever. Which totally makes sense, especially coming from somebody who's originally from Krynn, the world of Dragonlance, to have more non-human races in here, because Ravenloft tends to skew way towards only human, which I guess goes with the gothic horror appeal, but, having lizard folk horror, you could have actual draconians show up in this land, because that would totally make sense from where it originated from, instead of just being, it's another Eastern European country. No, it's from Dragonlance. Get some of that flavor in there. Next up, we have Har Akir with its mummy Dark Lord, Ankhtapat, and definitely based off of ancient Egyptian legends and lore. And the story now goes that Ankhtapat is desperately seeking for his Ka, his soul, his spirit. And he seeks it because his torment in Ravenloft is to be undying. All he wants is to be reborn, become mortal, and live his normal life instead of this unending undeath. But I'm not a huge fan of his backstory in 5th edition. I think they kind of scrubbed away the stuff that made it seem like he was deserving of becoming a Dark Lord. Now it's that he served as a priest under various pharaohs, and when the next one was supposed to come up, he tried to usurp the throne and take the power all for himself. Which, of course, is bad. I'm assuming especially from the ancient Egyptian view of things, but it doesn't seem quite as bad as what a lot of the other Dark Lords do. It's like usually, they're killing people and whatnot. And the older version of Ankhtapat was just that. He would experiment on his people, all in the search of immortality for himself, which that seems like the kind of thing that, hey, yeah, let's make this guy a Dark Lord. He deserves it. His own people rebelled against him eventually and mummified him, and then the Dark Powers brought him to Ravenloft then. I do like the search for the missing Koth. Having this quest for him to potentially get out is a cool story to have with it, because a lot of the older stuff was just mummies on mummies on mummies. Like, this mummy tries to take control from this other mummy. Okay, doesn't matter. Whereas now it's like, hey, here's a clear story you could go with this, which I think is better. I also like the changing of the children of Ankhtapat into these beast-headed forms, which now, of course, kind of goes along with the Ardling type of thing we got going on. But instead of just being, oh, he's a big bad mummy with bad mummies following him, with lesser mummies following them, just mummies all the way down. Yeah, let's shake it up. One character from the old lore that I found that I like is Kaibito, who is an undead Yuan-Ti cleric of Apep, this Egyptian chaos demon snake. And he corrupted a hidden oasis, which he then started calling the Oasis of Apep. And he corrupted it by slaughtering a bunch of priests of Osiris. You'll notice the old school Ravenloft did not change the names of the Egyptian deities at all, so I'm just going to refer to them what they did so in those old books instead of converting it to the new. So he slaughtered these priests of Osiris, corrupted the oasis, and now it's toxic to humans and home to fiendish snakes and poisonous plants. And he believes himself to be the avatar of Apep. But he's also been corrupted, and he feeds off the victims, the people who he lures to this oasis, and then they get poisoned, which I think that's cool. Undead Yuan-Ti cleric who eats the flesh of the people who drink it as poisoned watering hole. It's better than just another mummy. There was also this group called the Green Hand, who was a secret society of Osiris worshippers, so people who would definitely be against this Kaibitu guy. And the Green Hand's whole goal was to ensure that graves are undisturbed and that the dead do not rise, which in a land of undead creatures all over the place, that's a good group to join up with, I feel like. Har Akir was also prominently featured in the Touch of Death adventure module, which is the third in the Grand Conjuncture series, where Aslan caused all the shakeups to happen. And in that adventure, Ankhtapat rises again to deal with a new super, the other mummy, Senmet. And then during the course of all that and the changes that happen with the Grand Conjunction, eventually Har Akir is kind of fused together with two other desert domains of dread. One is Sebua, whose Dark Lord is Tiet, another mummy. Tiet's story is basically the plot of the Mummy with Brendan Fraser. She takes the role of the Ankh-Su-Namun mistress character, where she's the second wife of the pharaoh. She arranges for the first wife to be caught in a compromising position and executed. And then she starts having an affair with a priest. And then when they're found out, she forces the hand of the priest so that he'll turn her into a mummy. And then priest kills himself, and then she rises back up and eats the heart of the pharaoh, and then she's taken away to Ravenloft after that. And her domain is another, just based off ancient Egypt. But in this case, the society seems to have collapsed, so it's all undead, except for this small band called the Wild Children. These like ageless people who have this Stone Age culture. They don't really even talk that well, which is an interesting choice. They're also preyed upon by Musha, aka the Scabrous one, who they call Scabby, who is a desert vampire, which I could not figure out what that's supposed to mean, because I wouldn't imagine that vampires would like to be in the desert. I guess they could just come out at night and bury themselves in the sand during the day, but he's got the ability to summon jackals, is one thing I can tell you. Other than that, could not find any stats for D&D desert vampires, so if you know, let me know, because I'm interested. There used to be a whole bunch of, like, depending on your race, you would turn into a different vampire, so there'd be elven vampires or dwarven vampires. I think there's even like frost vampires, just a bunch of different types of vampires. But I'm curious what this one does. I would imagine instead of turning into a mist or fog, you could turn into like a thing of sand. That could be cool. And then the other domain that Harakir joined up with was Pharazia. And this one's cool. It's different. It's ruled over by Diamabel, who is a crusader who would kill all those who didn't follow the teachings of his deity. And after untold deaths because of that, he's taken away to Ravenloft and he becomes transformed into this angelic form, which is what he wanted, to be closer to the divine powers and get rid of heretics. Unfortunately for him, he's only in this divine angelic form during the day, and during the night he has this terrible undead form. But he also wields this flame blade weapon called Spirit Burner, which is pretty cool. I imagine it's got this like holy angelic fire during the day and then this necrotic evil looking fire during the night. And Diamabel is opposed by Sheikh Alan El Rashan, who leads the nomads of Pharazia, and he dual wields scimitars, in case you were wondering. And Diamabel and Pharazia are not based off specifically Egypt. It seems more off of the legendary Arabia, and Diamabel has a bunch of laws that he enacts and people have to follow. It's kind of like up in the air about whether or not there's really a deity that he follows. It doesn't seem like they've ever given a name specifically to him. But the whole bunch of codes and law stuff makes me think of the Code of Hammurabi. I don't know if that's what they were going for. But it definitely seems like Diamabel did not worry about making a just or fair. It seems more like if you do something wrong, he'll take you out because his whole thing is getting rid of all the heretics. It could be cool in 5th edition to stumble into one of these conjoined domains in your search for Anktapot's Ka, if your group chooses to do something like that. I think that could be a cool, like, oh, this is a little bit different. What's going on here? Speaking of what's going on here, next up is Haslin, a magical disaster movie ruled over by Haslik, the Red Wizard of Thay. And he encourages all his followers to push the very boundaries of magic, as he is fully aware that he is not where he's supposed to be. He knows that something is wrong with Haslin and that he's trapped here and he wants to escape. So he's saying, go hog wild. Let's see if we can bring this down. Meanwhile, he's watching it all through the eyes of Haslik, these magical sigils that allow him to spy on wherever they can see. And because the followers are allowed to do whatever they want with magic, it's resulted in a bunch of wild disasters. There's this toxic marsh due to alchemy gone wrong. There's a whole section where just purple worms are swimming all over the place. There's a forest that was turned to stone. Meteors crash in one particular space. All kinds of magical mishaps happening here. And part of the reason he pushes his followers to push the boundaries of magic is because ever since Haslik came to Ravenloft, he hasn't been able to learn any new magic. Now this part, I'm not sure how I feel about. It's a cool concept, but that was Aslan Rex's curse in the old school Ravenloft. So I guess if you don't have him, because he's all ephemeral in this version, giving that curse to somebody else, I guess makes sense. And it's way better than Hazlick's original thing going on, where he was just a complete racist and he had all this segregation and feuding between the ethnic groups of Haslan. So I'm very glad they got rid of that. And I guess if they weren't going to have Aslan Rex use it, why not give this curse of the inability to learn magic to somebody who is dedicated their life to learning more powerful magic, I guess. Okay, but I'm also kind of just upset that they don't have Aslan Rex. Like, he's not really there. Well, he should be. He's a cool character. Anyway, side tangent. There's a bunch of old school stuff that I think would be cool to bring back in. Stuff that isn't problematic. You got the Hill of 100 Paths. This is a place where ghosts patrol, and if anybody takes the wrong step, they'll attack them. I think that's a perfectly, why not have a cool necromancy area? There were also the tables, and these are stone fortresses that Hazlick used as laboratories in the cities of Slyvar and Toyalis. And there's some talk about followers of Hazlick in Van Richten's guide. But there's more info you can find in old school editions, like that daring genius Eleni back in the day had a hawk familiar named Zaglaive, who she gives a humanoid form so they can turn into a human or an Aarakocra, which is cool. Hazlick had a dread familiar who was a toad named Lurzid, who similarly could turn into a bullywug or a human. Hazlick also has a homunculus named Incubulus, which I love homunculi in 5th edition. They're just so adorable that any excuse, especially if you can make a creepy one that Hazlick owns, yeah, that'd be great. There's some more lore on the city of Ramuli. It's said that Hazlick raised it from stone in a single day, and some say that it itself is an arcane experiment, which is cool. Have this whole city that you're using as an experiment. Maybe the buildings are arranged into some kind of arcane sigil shape or something like that. And it was also home to the Red Academy, so a school of wizardry that Hazlick watched over, which of course, if he wants people to push magic, why not teach them how to do so? I really do like these ones where they take existing concepts from the D&D lore and flesh it out into we have these villains or we have this structure in place, so why not take something from that, the worst of the worst from D&D and just turn it up to 11, So the Red Wizards of Thay, who definitely deserve their own episode at some point, especially with them being the main villains of the D&D movie coming out. But this whole society of conquerors who use their magical might to oppress people and take power. Of course, somebody like that is going to push the bounds way too far and get wound up in the domains of dread. I think a supplement where you took some of the newer settings for D&D and gave them their own dread domain would be really cool. Because when Ravenloft originally came out, there was only so many out. But I feel like, why not go to Spelljammer? You could take someone like Volkara the Dark, who we talked about way back in the Medusa and Gorgon episode. This male Medusa, this Madar, who ran this whole empire of 12 different crystal spheres, imprisoned gods, made lycanthrope armies, all kinds of stuff. He deserves to be in Ravenloft, I feel. So why not have, your Spelljammer flies into some mist. You're in this dark space where maybe since he's the unstoppable conqueror, he's now running from some eldritch horror chasing after him. That seems like a good punishment for that guy. In Theros, I immediately think you could go with all the legends about Emperor Nero. You can have this ruler who is just cruel to be cruel. He watches his own city burn as he just plays the lute, Strixhaven is just right for, come on, having a dark academy, evil school teacher. It'd be perfect to have some kind of representation in Ravenloft with that. Going back to the other side of the coin, where taking the real world mythology and throwing it into Ravenloft, we have Ikath, ruled over by Xian Chang. It's definitely based off of China and their legends and folklore. And this is a domain of peace. It's idyllic. The people work tirelessly to make the most beautiful city they can for their wonderful ruler. At least that's how it is in their dream world. the domain of Ikath, the people there are almost always asleep. They are put into this idyllic, impossible version of the city where they endlessly work to make it better. Whereas in reality, they're all sleeping on these moldy, dusty, covered in spider webs. There's no food to eat. If they're found to be awake or stealing food, they are hunted down. Once again, while I like some of the changes that they've done for 5th edition, I feel like they got rid of the stuff that made it Ravenlofty. I don't know if Xian Chang deserves to be a Dark Lord in 5th edition. She was trying to make a perfect city. And it says she enacted stern, demanding laws, but also that they worked. She had this radiant center of learning and art, and then the people rebelled, her daughters were killed, and then she used a magic bell to wish for a perfect place, and then get sent to Ravenloft, which again doesn't seem warranted fully. Like, Ravenloft is for the worst of the worst. And of course, this could be sugarcoating what they intend for her to have done, but why at this point, you know? All it says is that she had stern and demanding orders. Strict, but sensible. That is not Ravenloft worthy. The old version, she was cruel. Her family was cruel. Except for her youngest daughter, who was known as Nightingale, who repeatedly spoke up about, hey, why are we being so cruel in our leadership? To which she was beaten repeatedly for. And the 4th time that happened, you'll see a recurring theme of 4. We'll get into that a little bit later. The emperor himself decided to step in and intervene, which led to Xian Chang murdering him, breaking her vow, and then that's what led them going to the Mist, which I feel like that is definitely more justifiable than, yeah, you were stern but fair. Like, really? Ravenloft for that? Okay. Like, what she's doing in Ravenloft is certainly terrible, but I feel like there needs to be a justification for why she's there in the first place. But going back to that number 4 thing, in Chinese culture, it's kind of like number 13 for us, unlucky number 13. It seems to derive from the fact that the word for in Chinese sounds a lot like the word for death. So it's kind of associated with those kind of connotations. So with Ikath, of course, you want to go with the unlucky number. So you got 4 daughters. The 4th time that she abused her, everything went to hell. Then the 4 daughters are also associated with 4 trees and 4 bells, which we'll get into in just a little bit. So, in old school Ravenloft, 3 of the daughters were these creatures known as Con Tin, who have madness-inducing screams, and they could possess people. And those 3 were named Hate, Spite, and Scream, which is a little bit on the nose. I definitely like the representation of the 4 daughters better in 5th edition. You got the one made out of eyes, and another one of teeth and stuff. They got a lot more unique, interesting stuff going on. And each of the daughters was associated with a bell. Xian Chang had tied her daughter's souls to these bells to prolong their life. So Spite had the Bell of Treachery, which had these gaki guardians that would protect it if it was rung. There's the Bell of Discord for hate, which would cause intruders to go berserk and attack each other. There's the Bell of Doom from Scream, which would summon up Oni to protect it. And then there's the Bell of Lament for Nightingale, which, if non-good intruders would approach it, it would ring out and cause damage. This magical reality warping bell in 5th edition, it's called the Nightingale Bell, based off that old lore. Then there were also 4 specific trees in the older versions of Ikath that I really liked. I feel like these could definitely be things that are part of that gem garden that people aren't allowed in. Maybe their branches reach over the walls and people can pluck things from it at their own dismay. Because you have the Tree of the Ravenous, which is a cherry tree. But if you eat the cherries, you become obsessed and try to kill anyone else who tries to eat from the tree. And even those who are killed in such a way will rise again in the pursuit of more. There's the Tree of Venom, which is an orange tree. The smell is quite tempting, but the fruit is entirely poisonous. Tree of Malice is a mulberry tree. If you eat from it, you become chaotic evil. Old school D&D definitely had a lot more of, your alignment changes. And then there's the Tree of Unending Lament, which is a willow tree, I think fittingly. And under it, you become uncontrollably depressed, and you'd weep, and you could sustain yourself by the leaves of the tree, if that's a good trade-off for you, which, given the starvation in Ikath in 5th edition, might be a thing some people would go for. I like the idea of the dual, the dreaming and the awake world. I'm not sure how I would do it in an adventure. It'd be cool to have the players go back and forth and learn information based on where they are. But yeah, it seems like a tricky one to run, but definitely interesting conceptually. But that is all we have time for this time around. There's plenty more to get to, and I plan on covering the rest of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, all the domains contained within there, but that'll have to be another week. Since we've already gone far long enough, I'll just sign off saying thank you for listening to Eldritch History. My name is Jacob Tomlinson-Korst. If you liked it, share it with a friend. And until next time, may you always make your saving throw, especially when it comes to identify fruit-bearing trees that might turn you evil.